this morning we talked about the content of manuscripts. We talked about being in the editorial process and responding to reviews and that sort of thing. This afternoon, in the first section, which is really two sections, we're going to try and help you write better and a little more effectively and more concisely. And then at the end of the day, we'll just talk a little bit about getting that done in your busy time, in your busy schedules. So I gave this citation really quickly earlier in the day, but what I'm going to talk about in this next section largely comes from Gopin and Swan. Gopin is a lawyer, actually, who for years went around the country teaching scientific writing. Why a lawyer was teaching scientific writing, I'm not 100% sure, but he was good at it. And a lot of what I'm described comes from there. And then another part comes from, there's a lot from William Zinsser. William Zinsser was the editor of The New Yorker for a long time, also taught at Yale writing. He's written a couple of really important books. The one by Douglas there is really interesting because if you're at all interested in neuroscience, it talks about the cognitive processes of reading and writing, and especially how a reader needs information presented to understand it clearly. So our writing is often pretty ineffective. So Mark Twain, obviously one of the strongest, best known American novelists, used plain, simple language, short words, and brief sentences. Mark Twain's telling us to use simple language. That seems pretty important to me. That is the way to write English. It's the modern way and the best way. Stick to it. Don't let fluff and flowers and verbosity creep in. Like, almost all of us went to undergraduate and high school and then undergraduate where people were trying to get us to use bigger words and make it look flowery and important, and I'm here to tell you to strip all of that away. And it's hard to unlearn, unfortunately. So we're often less clear than we think. We're often verbose. We're indirect. And our grammar is not necessarily that great. And I ask my wife all the time for grammar help. Like, I went to a small little rural upstate New York school system. No one could speak English well. We still can't. I don't know the rules of grammar. I figured, like, if I were to try to teach you the rules of grammar, I would fail miserably, but I can teach you how to write, sort of knowing the ins and outs of things. I still make grammar mistakes. That's okay. Someone will find it and fix it. Ask when you need help. So, as we mentioned this morning, writing is a skill that requires practice. Sometimes you just have to write, right? Like, get it done. It won't be that bad. We also talked about it being about communication. So this phrase, write for the reader, is directly from Gopin. That's a classic statement from his efforts. The idea there is that you have to understand what the reader needs in order to do this well. So we can't succeed in making even a single sentence mean one and only thing. We can only increase the odds that a large majority of our readers will tend to interpret our discourse according to our intentions. One of the challenges is that when we're talking, we had conversations over lunch. If I said something to the folks I was talking to and they didn't understand me, what happens? they ask me a question, right? They ask for follow-up. They say, what did you say? I'm sorry, I missed that. Can you explain that a different way? Can you do that when someone is reading what you've written? No, they don't have you to ask, right? So you have to preempt all of that in your writing. That's really hard to do. And it means that things that we think were clear, this goes back to my wife again, I think I'm being clear all the time. She doesn't always think I'm being clear. I don't know why. So I have to say it another way or say it again. So when we're speaking, it's relatively uncommon for it to remain ambiguous for a long time. When we're writing, it's very common for it to be ambiguous unless we take the steps for it not to be. So if someone fails to understand what you've written, that is on you, not them. It means you didn't write it clearly enough. Even if they were rushing, they should be able to understand it. So I'm going to give you a little example here of what what an issue might be. So just read this sentence to yourself and conjure up an image, like a visualization of this sentence. So someone tell me what they saw, what you see in your mind.
Horace was locked in.
Locked in what?
He doesn't say.
I know, but what's your image?
Oh, like in a cage or not?
In a cage. Yeah, that's a very common one. In a cage or in a room, right? Like he was locked in somewhere. Pardon? Yeah. So that's another good example. Like he had a bike, the lock was there, he didn't have the key, he was going to have to break it. So you can conjure up an image of like Horace the spy, where he's locked in the cage and he's going to use his little thing that he's got hidden away somewhere to get out. But what if Horace was a wrestler? What does the term lock mean in wrestling? It means a hold, right? Completely different scenario, but that sentence fits, right? So that sentence, even though it's a simple sentence, is quite ambiguous to the reader without other context. And I should add Horace the bicyclist. So even simple sentences get miscommunicated, and we interpret those results and those words and sentences and paragraphs in context, and we need that context to understand things. So when you write, you have to trust that the reader is smart. And one of the things that drives me absolutely nuts, and I don't know how many basic scientists are in the room, but I'm going to offend you in a moment. Basic scientists often think, well, you're just not in my field, you can't understand it. Meaning, you're not smart enough to understand what I do. And that is just not true for anyone in this room. Any of us can understand just about any scientific field if it's reasonably explained. So if I don't understand it, it means that you, as the writer, haven't taken the time to write it clearly enough in a way that's suitable for an intelligent reader, but doesn't happen to be in your field. Now, when you're talking about a subspecialty journal, okay, it doesn't have to be so I understand everything, but I should be able to get the gist of what you're talking about. So in order to understand writing, the reader has to first decipher what you're saying, minimize any ambiguities like, is this a spy or is this a wrestler? Put the words into grammatical categories, even if we couldn't actually verbalize what those categories are. I can't verbalize all the categories of words. but like noun and verbs and that sort of thing. And then file that information away and compare that to existing knowledge and decide what you're going to take away from it. That's a pretty cognitively complex thing to do. We do it sort of quickly and without thinking about it, but that's what we're doing when we're reading a sentence. So in order to facilitate this, languages have rules, and those rules create expectations. And so when you read a sentence, you have an expectation of what is where in that sentence. And when we violate those rules, we end up creating confusion. So we can also sort of say this in a more sophisticated way. Like when we read, we first have to identify the words that are being used, process the syntax, and then build some sort of inference about what's being said. So reading is really hard, and it's cognitively demanding. Think about the difference between when you read something first thing in the morning when you've slept well and when you're trying to read it after lunch. Or when you're listening to a lecture first thing in the morning or trying to listen right after lunch. It's easier first thing in the morning, right? Your brain is working better. So our job in writing is to reduce that cognitive demand. So when we say we're going to write for the reader, we're basically trying to anticipate what the reader needs to understand our communication. So that means we have to think about the words, the structure, and the content. And you formulate the words in a structure that they can then predict what's going to happen. So predictions facilitate understanding. So when we read something, we're actually constantly predicting what's going to come next. So that happens at the document level. Like when we've read the introduction, what do you expect? The methods are going to come next. We've read the methods, the results should be coming. When they're out of order, we get perturbed. That prediction goes all the way down to the sentence level. And if we don't predict accurately, we have trouble comprehending. And when we predict accurately, we are able to read quickly and smoothly and effectively. So all of those expectations facilitate the prediction and the understanding. So here's an example, and just take a moment, read this to yourself. So did anyone grasp that with one read through? No, generally not. And there's a reason for that. It's because the sentence tricked us. How did the sentence actually trick us in a couple different ways? So the first thing is we get to this word upregulated. We think that's the verb. We keep reading. We get a but that supports that upregulated was the verb. But in actuality, encode is the real verb. So we've gone almost 2 full lines before we hit what is the actual verb, and we're confused. So at this point, you have 2 choices. You can either forge ahead and hope that it all comes clear, which it won't because you're already confused, or you can abort and go back and start over. And if for those of you that aborted and started to go back to the beginning, you probably aborted somewhere right around here, roughly. And that's because you got to this point and your brain was like, something is not right here. So rereading is not desirable. That means it's not well written. Our job is to make it so you could read this sentence one without having to do that. So we expect the verb to be close to the noun. That's generally the thing. Here we encountered another verb-like word that fooled us. So our expectation wasn't met and our prediction was wrong and we messed up. So we get confused. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon is how to avoid that kind of thing happening in what you write. So if you read a paper and there are methods in the results and results in the methods, what happens to you and your thinking about that paper? You get confused. It's poorly written, right? Like you think something's wrong here. They don't know what they're talking about, right? Now, every once in a while you encounter a field where things that we think belong in the results go in the methods, like sociology puts stuff about how people got into the sample in the methods. Every time I'm like cutting it and move it, and my sociologist colleagues cut it and move it back, and we fight on that one, but most of the things we sort of have a good sense of where they go. So we have expectations of paper structure, so those things carry all the way down to the sentence and even the word level. Our mission is to make the reader read it clearly. We don't want anyone to have to think. Remember when we talked about it this morning in the table where I wanted you to say in your table to have both rows yes and no, and I said, don't make anybody do math? That's making people think when you make them do math. When we write clearly with the expected structure, we get better prediction, better comprehension, and when a reader has to think, it usually means my writing isn't clear. It doesn't mean that the reader's not smart enough. So I'll let you digest the 4 stages while I actually talk about the stages. But the stages of writing include planning that big picture, planning the sections, choosing which section you're going to start with, getting a little bit motivated and inspired to do it, because usually you don't want to, and then you have to start writing. And that big step, that last step of starting writing is a really hard one, because most of the time we didn't get quite enough motivation and inspiration to get going. And then once you've written a sentence, you can write a paragraph. But everything goes, you can't write a whole paper. You can only write a word and then a sentence and then a paragraph. So you have to do all of these things. And then keep in mind that once you have a manuscript, the whole point is that it's about rewriting and editing. So for the next couple hours, I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of stuff to do to make your writing better. But if you try to do all of this all at once, you won't write anything. Like you have to do this in the rewriting phase. So if you sort of distinguish between writing and editing, we write for content, we get our words down, we get those first big things down in your first draft, and then we rewrite it all to make it clear. So most of what we're going to talk about now is making things clear in the rewriting process. And that rewriting for clarity also will help us with writing more concisely and with continuity, make it more coherent, and we'll think about content. But make sure you get as much of the content the first time through and worry about the structure later. So fixing the structure through rewriting and editing. So in order to write better, and we're going to work through these things in more depth, we need to write simply. Forget about whatever your English teacher in 11th grade taught you about putting in the big words and things. Write simply. We're going to write concisely. We're going to get rid of words that don't need to be there. And we use a lot of words to say very little very often. We're going to get rid of clutter, and there's a lot of clutter. We're going to use structure to help with comprehension, just like we were talking about expectations. And then we're going to ensure continuity and vary the cadence, because that helps the writing be more readable, and follow the rules of grammar. Even when you don't know them, you're following them. Then you figure them out later when you're really far off. And we're going to be patient with this whole process. Being patient's really key. You can't, unless you're like a reporter for a newspaper where you have a deadline, generally speaking, you have time to be patient. So points 1 to 7, we're going to help you write more clearly, and number 8's also going to help. All right, so be clear. But since writing is communication, clarity can only be a virtue. If we try to talk and I mumble, I might be saying the same thing, but you can't understand me. Mumbling is the equivalent of a poorly written paper. It's a lot harder for you to get what I'm trying to say. And clarity, 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 when you become hopelessly mired in a sentence, it is best to start fresh. Do not try to fight your way through against the terrible odds of syntax. Don't be afraid to just scrap stuff. Like, get rid of it. If you're really attached to it, cut it and stick it at the end of your manuscript, and it's there until you get ready to send it off. Maybe you'll come back to it. Write simply, simplify, simplify. A simple style is the result of hard work and hard thinking. A muddled style reflects a muddled thinker or a person too arrogant, too dumb, or too lazy to organize his thoughts. So it's actually really hard to write simply. And one of the things when I talk about like forgetting what your high school teachers said, a lot of people react to that by but writing that way gives me style. Well, not really. Writing simply actually helps you communicate. And it's hard to write simply. It takes more editing to write simply than it does to write with more depth. Or depth isn't the right word. So editing is how we get to simplification. So clutter is a disease of American writing. We are a society strangling in unnecessary words, circular constructions, pompous frills, and meaningless jargon. That sounds like scientific writing right there. But the secret of good writing is to strip every sentence to its cleanest components. Every word that serves no function, every long word that could be a short word, every adverb that carries the same meaning already in the verb, every passive construction that could be active. These are things that weaken a sentence. So, and finally, I love this statement. Actually, they usually occur in proportion to education and rank. So fighting clutter takes a lot of time. We have to first get rid of rid of the clutter in our heads, and then think clearly means that you can write clearly. And once you can write clearly, your thinking will be more clear. So that's an important thing. Writing down is a form of thinking, and it helps you sort of work out your arguments, work out what those elements are that need to be there. And with clear thinking, we can be better writers. What am I trying to say? What are those 1 to 2 things in this manuscript? All right, we're going to turn to words. In case you can't see this, it says the language in this manuscript is wordy and indirect and uses unnecessary technical words and phrases. I'm very impressed. All right, write simply. So this is from a children's book, The Phantom Tollbooth. I never knew words could be so confusing, only when you use a lot to say a little. So more words makes it harder to digest. Simple words are better. Simple words provide concreteness. Our brains process simple words faster than they process complicated words. It makes it easier for you to connect words. When we read simple words, we read them faster, we comprehend faster, we move on to the next thing. we can retain them better as well. If I give you a paragraph that has a bunch of big long words, have you read it in the same amount of time, you can't tell me as much about that paragraph with those big words as you can a paragraph with short words. If I can speak the word quickly, it's easier to remember. Many of us, including me, when we read, we hear the words in our head. In theory, you're supposed to be able to read without doing that, but not all of us read that well. So we hear them, and if we have to say them in our head, it's harder. All right, here's a little exercise for you. And I'm going to put some words up here, and you're supposed to tell me what words to use instead of the words that are on the screen. So what do we say instead of a majority? Most, usually. All right, utilize. Use. Good. Shows. Now. Good. First. Try. Two letters. Is. Sometimes maybe you have to say known as, but usually just is will do the job. A few more. A vast majority. That could be most, or it could be maybe it's nearly all to capture the vast there. A few. This is called a buried verb. So we're going to talk more about buried verbs in a moment, but this is a noun that should be turned back into a verb. Agrees. This is also a buried verb, but not decided, right? So arrived at a decision is simply decided. Read. All right. I'm sure I told you this one in the 1 hour version, but it's still one of my least favorite words. Individuals. Why do I hate this word so much? Well, it's used a lot. It's a lot of syllables to say something really simple, and we have a whole bunch of words that actually are better. And lastly, the intended meaning of individual, like individual, is to be a contrast with a group. So when you have a group, you might have individual something or other within that group, right? Individual, you have a pack of Cub Scouts, you have a individual Cub Scout, right? But with individuals, we could be using a lot of better words. People, persons, adults, children, men, women, whatever word you want that applies, use it. There's no time that individuals is a better word than any of these. It's all over the place, though. If you look back 30 years, individuals was not used like this.
Some of the language recommended by, for example, in the addiction medicine journals, identify people of different races, backgrounds, ethnicities, specifies individual, as opposed to people.
Really, most of the time it's people, like people who inject drugs, people with HIV. To put people first, because
For example, like white people, white individuals. That was one of the things that came up. It sounds weird and
yeah, I would
pretentious to do that.
beg to differ with that one, because I would still want them to be people first,
Right.
as opposed to in a non-humanistic kind of term. So push back on that one. There's a lot of things that I'll have you push back on. So remember, try to reserve it for a contrast with a group. So the group's policy, oops, what did I just do? So this is a circumstance where individuals sort of make sense because we're talking about a group, and then now individuals within that group might disagree. Now we're going to get rid of words that are just clutter, meaning we have extra words. The question as to whether, what should we just say instead? We could say the question was, or we could just say whether. We could say no doubt. We could say undoubtedly, doubtless, certainly. Turn it positive. Yeah. Just analytically, we analyzed, something like that. She is. Becomes hastily, right? This is a bad one. Just becomes this subject. We're going to talk about this alone in a moment. Her story is strange, right? So each one of these are things that we would lapse into really easily, but they're also really easy to fix. But in order to fix them, you have to see them. And it's a lot easier to see them when I'm projecting them and telling you that something's wrong than when you're actually working on your own writing. Oops, I forgot one last one. The reason why is that. How about because? Good, right? All right. This is a good one. There we go. You never need an order, ever, pretty much. Innumerable number of, that's a dumb one, kind of. Many, numerous, countless. Large number of. Many. We now. Is. Is. All right. One of the things that people do a lot are these phrases that we have in English that are actually quite archaic, like various and sundry, fit and proper. That's called doubling down, and it's because the early English speakers in England, and after the Norman invasion in 1066, there were people from all over Europe, essentially, many of whom had different languages. And so they would combine words in a statement from two different languages to make the point. So things like aid and abet, any and all, basic and fundamental, each and every, all of those derive from that period of the English language where they were taking words from two different languages. English is one language now, so we don't have to use two different words. So just pick one and go with it. We do the same thing with modifiers. So basic fundamentals. If it's a fundamental, it's by definition basic. There's no other way to be finished than to have completely finished. Like I almost finished. That's different than, right? Like finished is finished. If you have consensus of opinion, like consensus means everyone shares an opinion, so that you don't need the of opinion. Continue, you don't need the on. Each individual, you only need the each. End result, you just need the result. Evidently clear, if it's clear, it's clear. If it's the outcome, it's final. If you're planning, that's in the future. My past plans, maybe then you needed to say that you meant to do something, but probably you could word it differently. If it's essential, it's important, etc. You get the idea. You also want to avoid redundancies. So if it's a necessity, it is absolute. There's no other way to collaborate than together. There's no other way to merge things than bringing them together. If it's innovative, it's new. If it's pooled, it's together again. If it's a crisis, if it's throughout the entire. And if it's visible, nearly always we're talking about to the eye. Now maybe you're a microbiologist and you're talking about microscopically visible. Fine, then add something that gives you a qualifier. Another thing to avoid is just redundancies. The V is virus, the I is infection, the D is disorder there. I once read a poor graduate student's application for NIH funding where in the entire thing he wrote STI infection every single time. That was painful to read on one hand. And B, just kind of every time it was like a little poke in the eye, like, he didn't get the grant, but not because of that. And we comprehend things in a positive way more rapidly than negatives. So we can simplify negatives by saying different instead of not the same, or not many becomes few, did not becomes failed to. So we're using a verb that we recommend, like we can recognize, that gives the negative in a way that we read more and process more quickly. Does not have becomes lacks, did not accept becomes rejected, did not consider becomes ignored, and not necessary becomes unnecessary. So all the words on the right are words that exist in our language that convey the negative without having to use the word not. So if you're using the word not, try to think of, is there a word that I can use that would capture that and make it more direct? Oh, I have one more. Not certain becomes uncertain. So almost always this sense of negativity creates more cognitive burden. So flip it around, get rid of the not, use a more active verb. Anyone have a suggestion for this one? Three-legged dog. This is terrible. Territories with conditions of high population. Yeah, let's say densely populated territories. That works pretty well. This is just using the right word. Homogeneous, we actually want the E in there. Homogeneous means a different thing. Heterogeneous and not heterogeneous. Include the second, that other E there. All right, which of these is correct? First one or the second one? Second one, right? We are not investigating principles. We are the primary investigator. So one of the things that people do is add a lot of words that don't need to be there. So rich, ornate prose is hard to digest, generally unwholesome, and sometimes nauseating. And so essentially getting this idea of ruthlessly deleting the excess. Everything we just did, we shortened. Get rid of those words. And we're going to talk about some words that you can really get rid of virtually every time. I love that phrase. Once you get into this, it's so much fun to take someone else's thing and you start, and then it's better. I haven't done yours yet, sorry. Adverbs. So an adverb is generally one of those that ends in ly, so loudly, tightly, that sort of thing. So do we need that loudly in that sentence? No, right? Like we have a really strong verb. So is there any other way to blare a radio than loudly? No. We can't clench our teeth any other way than tightly because the verb is so good, we don't need an adverb. It actually kind of weakens it when we stick the other things in there. So adjectives are also often unnecessary, sort of extra decoration that doesn't need to be there. So I was looking for an example, so I turned to my own writing and I went through a paper and I was like, why did I do that? So these dramatic effects have important implications for HIV prevention among PWID worldwide. Like, I was trying to make a point, sure, but when you take out the dramatic and you take out the important, it actually reads pretty strongly and captures the information quite nicely. These effects have implications for HIV, and it doesn't feel like I'm trying to convince you. Yet when I do it this way, it's like I'm trying too hard. And this way, I'm just stating the facts. Too late to take it out now, though. You also want to avoid little qualifiers. There are lots of clutter, so looking for the words like a bit, rather, quite, very, in a sense, all of those things can almost always come out. This work is quite important. That actually makes it seem like it's less important than if you just say this work is important. Little qualifiers sort of undermine that authority and make it less punchy. So don't be kind of bold, be bold, right? You get rid of the kind of, it's a stronger statement. So if you ever need to shorten a manuscript, just go through and delete every very, quite, and rather that you've written in the manuscript, and you'll be stunned how many times you use those words. Especially very. We use very like all the time. And when we use those words like dramatically, it puts you on guard a little bit, like they're trying too hard. And that's what Strunk and White is saying here. Basically, like if you have those in there, it tends to diminish your effectiveness. So how do we overstate? With all those little adjectives like very and quite and that sort of thing. All right, we're going to move on to sentences now. We've been talking about words. Hopefully you have mentors that are a little more kind than this professor. When we have sentences, we have basically three key elements. There's the topic, the verb, and the stress position. Topic is sometimes sort of thought about as the subject, and then the verb we know, and the stress position is the end. So we use the topic position of a sentence as an anchor. It tells us what the sentence is about. And the verb gives us the action, tells what's happening. And the stress position we pay a lot of attention to when we read what's at the very end. It's like what's important in this very short story of a sentence. So use the topic position really effectively. The first things should go first in the sentence, and it helps give readers context and perspective. So remember earlier today I talked about the introduction being about the science and not about the literature. Well, our goal in a sentence is also to be about the science and not about the literature. So we want the topics of our sentences should focus on what we know, not the literature itself. So we don't want to put things like the literature as the subject, or previous research, or Gaines et al. Have shown. We want to use the science instead. So what do I mean? Previous research has shown that the Earth is round. 5 of those words are completely unnecessary. 4 words are necessary. And it shifts our topic position from previous research to what we actually care about, the Earth. It becomes the Earth is round, and we give a citation. Smith and Jones previously demonstrated that cats have whiskers. Cats have whiskers. right? Both of those give you exactly what you need in a way that's effective and concise, and also easier to process cognitively. So one of the things that I'm often asked at this point is like, but what about you're trying to say this paper said this and this paper said that? What do I do then? Well, we have a lot of words that work for uncertainty. We can say the earth may be round, cats probably have whiskers, and we use these words all the time: uncertain, unknown, unclear, controversial, ambiguous. Whatever word you want, we have in our language to express uncertainty, and you don't have to say, you know, paper 1 said this, paper 2 said this. Instead, talk about the this and the that instead of what the papers were. Another thing we want to do is avoid the isolated pronouns. So isolated pronouns are words like it and their, that sort of thing. So whenever we have those at the beginning of a sentence, they indicate that there's clutter within the sentence. So look for them and then get rid of them. So what do I mean? It is clear that becomes clearly. It is important that we understand becomes we must understand. Okay? Some real life examples. In the 1990s, there were approximately 600,000 hysterectomies performed in the US annually. So how do we rework this? Anytime you see there at the beginning like that, nearly always, well, it pretty much has to be followed by a form of the verb to be. And what's actually important is usually the part that's right after that verb. So the important part is the approximately 600,000 hysterectomies, right? So we can rewrite it. In the 1990s, approximately 600,000 hysterectomies were performed in the US annually. Or we might revise it to make it more active and say gynecologists performed approximately 600,000. Either of those are acceptable. Part of it is changing the focus of the sentence. The top part, the focus is on the hysterectomies. The bottom part brings it to the gynecologists. Another one, within an enumerated part of the Lobisa subdistrict, there are 2 surveys that can be linked together with a unique identifier. First of all, before we go to the there, does anyone see another problem in this sentence? Linked together, right? It can just be linked. Okay? So we're going to rewrite this one. We're going to move to the part that's right after the verb, the to be. So R, right after the R, we get 2 surveys, and then we revise our verbiage, where the verb goes, and we end up with a much more readable and digestible sentence. Sorry. All right, since there is no standardized definition of mastitis, same principle. Definition is not standardized. We could also say, since mastitis is not defined consistently, those little things, even though it doesn't seem like much, just make it easier for everyone to read. It remains unclear whether CTL function is impaired in ham-TSP patients. So it is beginning the sentence. I said whenever you see that, try to figure out ways to revise it. We can do this in a bunch of different ways. So we could say whether CTL function is impaired is unclear. The impairment of CTL function is uncertain, unclear, unknown. This one, takes that verb impair and buries it up there as a noun, so maybe that's not the best way to do it. So let's try to bring that out and say CTL function may be impaired in these patients. We're getting better. And then if it's really about the patients, you would flip it around the other way. So this one has a different problem. And the problem is actually really in the second part of the sentence, or the second sentence rather than the first. So in this one we have the word these. And it's a different type of isolated pronoun. The these here should have a noun after it, because the these is referring back to something in the previous sentence, and it requires the reader to fill in that space. And you may or may not fill it in correctly, right? So we could just make it more clear and bring in the word covariates to make it clear that that's what we're actually talking about. So anytime I read a paper where I have a these or a this alone, isolated, I'm going to always ask you this what, these what. And they're called pointing words or deictic terms, and they point to an antecedent, something in the previous sentence. You have to make sure that the reader knows what it is. So this what, these what, in order to make it clear. Subject and verb, generally we want to keep the subject and the verb close together. That stress position and the verb go together. Anything in between gets distracting and it makes it harder to digest. So just like that example in the beginning, we don't want sort of false verbs in there, and we want to bring the noun and the verb close together. And the bigger the disruption, the harder it is. So here's a example. Take a second and read it. Again, for most of us, this is not our field. Doesn't seem really easy to read, right? Like you're holding, the reason that's a problem is because you're holding so much in your head all at once. So a very simple fix is to just take the beginning, bring the verb way back to the beginning, and then you have a clause that explains what that is, and this becomes the stress position rather than something you're holding in your head until you get to the end of the sentence. Many of us, when we were taught scientific writing, especially years ago, were taught to write passively. Don't write passively, write actively. So the active form of this first one is what? Even better than the authors recommend. We. Claim it. You're the author. Don't talk about yourself in third person. Bill recommends. No, I recommend. It's okay to say I.
Is this a universal feeling among editors?
Pretty much, yes. Unless maybe you're publishing in an English journal from Germany, where they still like passive voice. I do this course in Germany and they push back on this part a lot. They're like, people always tell me to do it the other way. I'm like, it's not good English. All right, the following results were obtained. We obtained the results we observed. Part of the reason that editors embrace this, in addition to it being clear, is it's fewer words. It was discovered that a sustained coordinated effort would be required, becomes we need a sustained coordinated effort. But just keep in mind that when you change things to active, there are times when passive is okay or actually necessary. So here are two sentences. Bees disperse pollen. Pollen is dispersed by bees. Which one is active and which one is passive? First one is active, the second one is passive. So which is preferable? Exactly, it depends. This is a case where it depends. Why does it depend? What does it depend on? It depends on what we're actually talking about. In the previous example, if we were talking about pollen, it's okay to be passive because pollen gets carried around passively. But if it's really about bees, then we really want the active form, right? So every once in a while, there is something that is acted upon passively. You have to use a passive voice in that context. So verbs are really important. They give you strength, like that sense of a radio blaring. So using good verbs and not too many to be's is important. So use the meaningful verbs when you can. So to be or not to be, the answer is not to be, because you don't want that many is's and are's and were's and was's in there, because you can usually find a better verb. Not always, but sometimes you can. They just get kind of dull. So make the actions the actors whenever possible by using a strong verb. One of the ways we can do that is by unearthing buried verbs. So antibody detection was accomplished by Team A. So I'm giving you a hint with the color. What is the buried verb? Detect, right? So we find the detect, and then Team A detected the antibodies. That makes it active. That's good. And if you really needed it to be passive, to be about the antibodies, then you say they were detected by Team A as opposed to antibody detection. So in that last sentence, we're getting the antibody there to be the stress position. That's good. The sentence is really about antibodies. And then we're using the stronger verb. Buried, yeah.
Are you going to talk about articles later?
A little bit. If I don't, ask me whatever it is you want me to try and.
Yeah, I was just wondering because like I like to write articles, and that might be because my first language is French, and in French and other Romance languages, words have like it's either feminine or
Yeah.
masculine. But sometimes I'll write and someone will edit and remove the article. Like sometimes it makes sense, but other times it's like, then what's the point of the word though if you're going to take it out every time I mention it?
There's a reason they take out the, because, and it's not a good reason, but it's an okay reason. So in English, we don't distinguish male and female. I don't talk about this, so this is good time to do that. So in English, we do not distinguish male, female nouns. Very often, an article like the or an helps. Like most of the time, it helps. But every once in a while, it's sort of ambiguous. And when you're trying to get down to a word count of 3,500, the can sometimes be sort of extraneous. Should it be taken out? Probably not, but it probably doesn't matter too much. But if you read it and it's like, something's missing, put it right back in. It's not wrong to have it in, and it might be wrong to have it out in some circumstances, but it's often just removed because we can. And if you think about it, it's gotten worse with email, right? In email, we even often drop the whole subject. Like, instead of saying, I am going home in our text or our email, it just becomes going home. So then that carries over to everything else, and we lose the rest of it. So we have to actively put them back sometimes.
I have a notion about passive versus active sentence that
Uh-huh.
might be wrong. I like passive sometimes because I feel it's more like stating a fact. It's more objective. While the active seems like I have a notion of more subjective, like waiting like an hour, like
Yeah.
pause on the radio.
I think that's just because people trained us to think that way. It's not true at all. Like, there's something sort of academic about saying the authors recommend. Like, it's like divorcing us from that recommendation. But it's really us, not anyone else. So why not claim it and own it and be positive with it? It gives it this artificial, like, pompousness in a way. Like, when you read the authors recommend, I get this like image of old white guys in tweed coats sort of sitting around recommending something, which that's just wrong, right? Like, so it's us. Let's recommend and move on. All right, back to buried verbs. They're also called nominalizations, sort of the fancy term, but they're everywhere. All these words are examples: utilization, development, communication, measurement, penetration. All of those could be verbs. So when you see them, think about, can I make it into a verb that's going to make it strong? Even things like love and hope and liberty, those words are both nouns and verbs. So when you use them as a noun, you ask yourself, can that be a verb in this circumstance? And a lot of times it can. Once we start making these ION things or MENT things, we make it much more abstract for our brains and make it harder to digest. So flip them around and make it into a verb. And very often they occur very close to to be as the verb. So unbury it whenever you can. So help me find the buried verbs in this sentence. So measurement, and I heard the other one, review. There's actually two here, right? And it's also got the there at the beginning, so we don't like that either. So we're going to fix this somehow. So we've got measurement, we've got review, we've got there. So maybe we say, first we reviewed the measurement of systolic blood pressure. That's taken one of them and made it into a verb. We're not going to have two verbs, so that's a start. That's a simple sentence, but it has two different interpretations depending on what we mean by measurement. So it could be that we reviewed how to measure blood pressure, or it might be we reviewed how it was measured, and those we can see both of those derive from the other one, and we would have to know which one we were talking about to decide which way it should be. This has nothing to do with buried verbs, although there is one in the beginning, but not one that you could probably change, because concentration is a buried verb, but not one that we're going to change in this context. So this is a simple mistake, but it's one that is common and one that arises from the separation of the stress position and the verb. And other than the fact that this is a really hard sentence to read, the answer is that the subject and the verb don't agree. So concentration is singular. We're fooled by the acids there, so we made it plural. So we fix that by bringing them closer together, get rid of it, and then looking at the subject-verb agreement. But the way we really fix this sentence is to rewrite it all together. Maybe we should just remove that intervening clause and make it a much more readable sentence. Sialic acids are composed principally of amino sugars attached to polysaccharides, lipids, or proteins, period. Sialic acids are concentrated in the mammalian epididymis. This was not the point of this series, but it shows a different fundamental point, which is very often when you have a big, long intervening phrase, make it into two sentences and life is better. If you notice, a few slides ago, there was another circumstance with a big, long intervening phrase. When I fixed it, it ended up being 2 sentences. So we pay attention to the very end of the sentence, much more than we recognize, and we think that the end of the sentence is going to be really important. So use that position effectively. So arrange the sentence to put important information at the end. So here's an example. Participants reported no adverse events during the last 6 months of follow-up. So which is more important here, the no adverse events or the last 6 months of follow-up? No adverse events, right? So let's bring that out as a clause and put the no adverse events at the end. So now when I move on to the next sentence, I'm thinking about the adverse events rather than trying to remember back to what was actually important in the sentence. Simple sentences, every sentence can really only have one thought, and when we read very, very linearly. So if you try to do too much in a sentence, the reader's going to get confused. So make things simple and break it into 2 or 3 sentences if you need to. Long sentences are really hard to read because we have those 3 elements, the stress position, or I'm sorry, the topic, the verb, and the stress, no matter how long the sentence is. You don't get more of those in one sentence. So if you muddle it about with lots of extra words, it becomes much harder to digest. When we have long sentences, our brains have to work really hard. And if you have a brain like mine, that's really difficult. My brain does not retain stuff well, even for short periods of time. So I have to work really hard to read a sentence that's more than a standard length. So don't make me work that hard. And I'm not alone in this. This isn't not solely my problem. We remember what's in the stress position in the end. We don't remember all the gobbledygook in between. Now, if you make everything like 5-word sentences, it's going to be really painful to read, right? So you have to vary the length some, and you do that with like clauses at the beginning of the sentence, that sort of thing. So work to vary the length to improve the flow, and we're going to talk about transitions in just a bit because they really help in terms of how a sentence or how multiple sentences fit together. So a few myths. Never end a sentence with a preposition. Not true. Never split an infinitive. You can boldly go where no person has gone before. Star Trek reference in case you didn't. That's allowed. Never split a verb phrase like have seen. Never begin a sentence with and or but. That's also allowed. Never begin a sentence with because. Never use since to mean because. Never write a 1-sentence paragraph. Never use I or me. All of these are myths. They've been propagated through years of middle school and junior high teaching, which is just unfortunate. Now, historically, splitting an infinitive was a bigger deal, but that has clearly worked its way into our lexicon. All right, I'm going to finish up this section with a lengthy example where I'm going to have you read like 2 paragraphs. They're technically only 2 paragraphs. They do sort of fill up the whole page. And as you read it, I want you to pay attention to unnecessary words, clauses, how concise it is, clarity. Also think about, is this something you might be reading in your own literature, even though it's a different field probably from what you're doing unless you do HIV stuff. And then think about how easy it is or difficult it is to understand the paragraphs. So here's the first one. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one even if you didn't quite finish. Paragraph 2. This paragraph immediately followed the previous one in the original text. All right. Did anyone find this easy to read? This was easier? A little bit easier than the first part. Well, they're all part of one thing, so. Do you feel, how comfortable would you feel if you had to give a brief description of this to another person without rereading it? Not much, right? So some of the things, like I highlighted some of them. So this whole paragraph is totally about the literature and not the science, right? I highlighted all the such and such et al. I don't care if Sager did it. Sager might care if they did it, but Sager would probably be content with the citation. They don't need to be called out in the text. So let's look at a revision of these two paragraphs. So first of all, all of it fits on one slide now without changing the font. Read this and see what you think. So, is this clearer? When you walk away after having read this, do you have some sense that you know what was being said? So this is me, the others were the original. The purpose of showing you this is to show that how you write it makes a big difference, right? Like, none of us are experts in the CCR5 co-receptor, I don't think, in this room. But we can still read it and get the gist of what's going on here. So most of what I've done is taken out unnecessary stuff. Like all those clauses that were in the beginning of the sentences, I've made things more active. Just following the rules that we just talked about makes a big, big difference. The part I'm going to tell you next is probably the most important part of the entire day. So I would like you to wake up. We're about to launch into paragraphs, make this the unit of composition. And paragraphs are all about continuity. And so generally you begin with some sort of paragraph head, like the topic sentence, and then work your way into the meat of the paragraph. And paragraphs are where we usually get lost. Like I've shown you a couple of examples where you get lost in a sentence, but it's much more common to get lost in a paragraph. So in order to improve continuity of your paragraphs, old before new is like the thing I want you to walk away from this class remembering. So old before new means that you put old information before new information. And it's really like, once you figure this out, it will really help both your own writing, but the writing of everyone you read. So has anyone ever written a paragraph and someone read it and they said to you, this doesn't flow? Pretty much everyone's had that experience, right? How many times when they said this doesn't flow, this is how you fix it? Almost never, right? They just say this doesn't flow, and you're left to like try and figure out why it doesn't flow. Well, the reason it doesn't flow is because you didn't follow old before new. And no one knows what that even means most of the time. It can also be called familiar unfamiliar, meaning that familiar information comes before unfamiliar information. So old before new means that you put old information in the topic position of a sentence to link backwards to the previous sentence. So when I'm reading, I'm remembering the previous sentence as I start the next sentence. And so I'm expecting to see something that links back to that previous sentence. So when I don't have that information, it becomes problematic, and that's where a lack of flow comes in. So put in the topic position the old information that links backward, put in the stress position the new information you want the reader to emphasize. So it's also called referential continuity. One sentence refers implicitly or explicitly to the content of the preceding sentence, and essentially it creates an unobtrusive chain of references to make things continuous. So whenever someone says it doesn't flow, or whenever you read it and you think it doesn't flow, fix this. And there are basically two ways that it happens. One way is that the second sentence is inverted, meaning that the new information is coming first before the old information. The second way it happens is with logical gaps, meaning that you left out something altogether. And you're just getting old before new and then new and new. Logical gaps occur pretty often. Basically, there's no linkage at all to the previous one. You have to bridge those gaps to make it flow. So old before new still applies to logical gaps. So let's look at an example. Before you read this, also remember we were talking about expectations, right? So this is a classic example of expectations. And I'm going to have you read this sentence, and when you've read it, I'm going to ask you what comes next. What should the next sentence begin with? So, young women in South Africa face an unparalleled HIV burden. By the time they reach the age of 21, more than a third will be infected. So, without thinking hard, what do you predict the next sentence is about? This is an easy question, actually. Everyone always looks like they're trying to think really hard. It's going to be about young women in South Africa with HIV, right? That's what you're expecting the sentence to be about. So this is the way it was originally written. So if you reread the sentence, it ends, more than a third will be infected, period. Unequal sexual relationship power may play an important role in contributing to high HIV incidence among South African women. So when you read that in continuity, right in the middle there, you get a little whack to the head, like, whoa, what? Like, why is that there? You're not expecting anything about unequal sexual relationship power. You're like, that, what? And then the tendency is to go back and read the sentence again. Because you're like looking for the unequal sexual relationship power that you completely missed. Well, you missed it because it wasn't there. So how do you think you fix this? This is an example of an inverted sentence, and you flip it around. So the reason you have this problem is that red part there, unequal sexual relationship power, is new information. the blue, the high HIV incidence, is the old information, and this second sentence has new before old. What did we want it to be? Old before new. Let's flip it around. So now you can focus on the lower half. The top half is just restating it. Now when you read it, it goes logically from one sentence to the next. You're like, ah, cool. I know what's going on. And it goes nice and smooth. So once we've done that, what would you predict the next sentence to be about? So it could be about unequal sexual relationship power. We also have one other option. Something else about HIV burden. Right? It could, if it started out something like the HIV burden is also due to, we would be fine. Or if it said this relationship power is attributable to or due to something else, we would be fine. But if it starts out with like men in South Africa, you would be like, that's not what I'm expecting. So 2 bits of old information gives us 2 options, and either one would work. So most likely it's going to be something about sexual relationship power, just the way it's written, but it could have been something about the HIV burden. All right, here's another example. PWID with HIV often engage with HIV treatment services late. So what do we expect this next sentence to be about? Something about HIV treatment services, possibly something else about HIV, but it's got to be within that realm. Instead, what we get is viral suppression and possible mortality. That doesn't flow, right? So again, all we have to do, flip it around and make it work. And again, it's old information coming after new information that's the problem. So improving access to HIV care, that follows from the HIV treatment services. So giving access could increase viral suppression and possibly reduce mortality. Again, just flipping it around, we can make it work. Here's a longer paragraph. Take a minute and read through it. Does anyone find a place where your head went a little bonkers? It's chronic undertesting of STD patients. Like, what? It's like everything else is going along pretty hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden there's a new thing. And this one is an example really of a logical gap where there's something missing altogether. So another example, this one is across paragraphs, actually. Improving surgical outcomes in the elderly. We come down to these guidelines specify 13 key issues of preoperative care in the elderly, including functional and nutritional status, cognitive impairment, frailty, comorbidities, and preoperative testing. And then when we get to this one, the abbreviated geriatric assessment represents a clinical tool that addresses each of these 13 domains. That's referring back to up there. So why not bring the 13 domains to the beginning of the sentence? Now, when you have across paragraphs, it's fine to have a gap because it's quite, you're changing the thought. But if you can link back to the previous paragraph, it will improve the flow to do that. So we could bring out the 13 domains and say something like, these 13 domains of preoperative care have been incorporated into an abbreviated geriatric assessment. So anytime a paragraph doesn't flow, ask yourself if the topic and stress positions are aligned properly. Does the old come before the new? And if you list out those pieces, you'll often find, often you can just do it by highlighting, or if you print out a page and underline, you'll figure out that the new is coming before the old. So should some of the end, sometimes should the end come before and start the sentence? This happens all the time though, and it will happen to you consistently. And there's a very, in my mind, a very logical reason for it. It's because we're writing, first of all, writing is hard. We made ourselves sit down to write. We're getting going. And we write a sentence, and then we have this brilliant idea of what the next sentence needs to be about. So in our brilliant idea, we put that, what the sentence is about, first, and forget to link it back, and then we link it back at the end. And it's like we have this idea, let's get it out there. So we write it in the beginning of the sentence. And what we need to do is remember that we have to tie it back to the beginning and then flip it around. So you will almost always have this problem, and if you read it or someone else reads it and says it doesn't flow, flip things around. The more you practice, the better you'll get at it. Like I can now catch myself in that moment when I'm writing where I'm like, oh, I can't put that yet. I need to put this first and then do it. But that took a bit of practice. So another way to do it is with simple transitions that link backwards. So example transitions are words like also and furthermore and but and although. So you're sort of using those words to link back to the previous sentence. We have a lot of transitions in English. They can represent continuity. They can represent contrast, frequency, order, like first, second, third, examples, cause and result, conclusion. So like when you use an example, you don't have to restate the sentence. You're using for example to help you know, the reader know that this next thing is an example of what you just said. Mood changes essentially use words like but or however or nevertheless to change the direction of the paragraph. They can be really helpful in that transition to make a strong statement. So I'm going to make a quick plea for the word but. Everyone likes the word however in scientific writing, but however is a little bit like to me like writing the authors. It's a like really wimpy word. It's sort of like however. It's like however. Okay. But is a good word. It's short, it's strong, it makes the point. I'm changing things up here. Right? So given the interventions emphasis on MAT, participants may have overstated MAT use. But the validity is supported. Think about this sentence with however. You read that sentence with however, you're like, is it really supported? Maybe. But I use but. I believe it. But's a good word. Embrace it. I almost never use however. Every once in a while there's a however like in the middle of a long sentence. I don't like long sentences generally, so I don't end up using it very much.
So, you mentioned this, grade schools, beginning sentences with but, because, and I just remember like the scrap, the
Yeah.
mark. And then I also have senior mentors who will
Still do that.
So I'm curious when you're in that sort of position, how you should respond to that recommendation to get rid of but and because in the beginning of sentence.
Yeah, just tell them no.
No. Right? Someone
No.
who has years of experience writing
Yeah.
telling you that it's kind of hard for, you know.
Again, if it's a little like the limitations thing, right? Like people have grown accustomed to things, they think it's right, it's not right. So if they're insistent and the relationship is important, then let it be. It's not going to hurt anything. On the other hand, is if you can convince them to just let it be for a little bit and let them sort of grow into it, eventually they usually come around. Like, I never used to use because at the beginning of a sentence. I was taught I wasn't supposed to. I never used to use a semicolon as a, like, between two full sentence clauses kind of thing. I was told never to do that in 7th grade, and Mrs. Persons would not let us use a semicolon. It took me 30 years to overcome that, but now I love semicolons. So people are educable. So just try and work it in, and maybe it'll get there. I used but at the beginning of a sentence for a long time before I ever used and at the beginning of a sentence. And and's harder for me to do, but there are times when it's like, oh, that actually flows really nicely with the and there. So it will happen. Just a few more other examples of transitions, like in contrast here, although, in addition, all of these are ways to link back in a way that doesn't require like the full clause to be the old information, because it softens that transition. Parallel construction is just an important part where you have slightly longer sentences with two elements. Make sure they're structured in the same way. So the first one does not use parallel construction. Science was taught by the textbook method, while now laboratory method is used. Flip that around a little bit. Now it is taught by the laboratory method. The it here is okay because it's a short enough sentence that you understand that that relates back to the science. But it's in the same structure. It makes it much easier to digest. Topic sentences, we talked about that a little bit this morning. Generally, they're really helpful in scientific writing. It allows us to telegraph what's going to be coming. You don't always have to have a topic sentence, but generally speaking in scientific writing, that's a better way of building your paragraph. We talked again this morning about skimming. Topic sentences really help you move forward. All right. Take a second and read through this. And this one is just an example of how a paragraph sort of can lose you a little bit, and then you wonder, like, what was this really about? And so when I read this paragraph, I get to the sarcopenia part, and I think this paragraph's really supposed to be about sarcopenia, but it's been about frailty most of the way through. So what exactly is going on? So this is an example where I would have argued for something about sarcopenia towards the top, or sarcopenia with frailty as my topic sentence to guide me into this, because I got a little lost because of that in the process. I will say that this is Angie Smith's example from when she was sort of sitting out there where you are, in case you know who Angie is. So if you have problems with flow, use post hoc. She wanted me to say that, by the way. Use post hoc examples or outlines. Sort of go through, look at your topic sentences. Do they flow in a logical manner? This is really helpful in grant writing, especially the significant section. Do your topic sentences build the case that you want? It's also most helpful in the introduction and the discussion of a manuscript. All right, a little bit about grammar and other things. As I said, grammar is not my strength, but we'll make some points. If you have a chance, you'll have access to all the slides later. Go visit Weird Al's Word Crimes video. We aren't going to do that here and now, but it's great fun. All right. So first, avoid anthropomorphizing. That means making inanimate objects animate. So a study can't aim to do anything, doesn't have the capability of aiming. The data can't suggest anything. We have to read the data. In general, there's verbs that end in ick and ickle, or not verbs, adjectives ending with ick and ickle. In the US, we tend to use those interchangeably completely, except for a few circumstances like historical and historic, where they mean different things. And generally, it's actually preferred to use the form that has the AL. It's not essential, but it's preferred. And sometimes they actually have meaningful differences. So like we say empiric antibiotics all the time. That's actually completely incorrect. It should be empirical antibiotics. And empiric is a person. Empiric is a noun that could know ahead of time which antibiotic they could use because they have that power to digest it or predict it. And then also be careful when or when not you really mean the study of something. So do you mean viral or virological? Do you actually mean methods or methodological? All right, which of these is correct? First one, second one, trick question. Anyone vote for trick question? So trick question, they're both correct. And that's because normally you would think of 10 liters as being plural, but in the first case it's being used as a composite group, so it ends up being similar there. Anything wrong with this sentence? Please tell me there is. Please, should be were, right? The data were imprecise. Data is plural. What's the singular? Datum. Now, it should be these data, not this data. Now, unfortunately, in journalism, the the Associated Press and a couple other organizations have decided that it can be used as a singular. So if you ever write for the lay press, they will change all your R's to is. But if you write for scientific journals, they'll change your is's to R's. I don't understand why they decided that. In your results section, generally, there's a few things to be aware of. Use approximate numbers when you can. So if something is like 52%, people remember around half better than they remember 52%. Generally, I'm not going to talk about the p-value thing now. Be sure to interpret odds ratios correctly, mostly because it's odds, not a risk ratio. So it's the odds were 2 times as high. And then risk ratios, it's 2 times as likely, not 2 times more likely. All right, which of these sentences is correct? The only difference is the capitalization in the bottom one. First one's correct, right? But the number of times that you see people that think because they're making an abbreviation that they have to capitalize it, it's very common, and that's not true. The first one is correct. That's totally acceptable. All right, take a second, read through. Actually, I'm going to read it aloud to you. A panda walks into a cafe, he orders a sandwich, eats it, then draws a gun and fires 2 shots into the air. Why? Asks the confused waiter as the panda makes toward the exit. The panda produces a badly punctuated wildlife manual and tosses it over his shoulder. I'm a panda, he says, look it up. The waiter turns to the relevant entry and sure enough finds an explanation. Panda, period. Large black and white bear-like animal, comma, native to China, eats, comma, shoots and leaves. So punctuation matters. So I once had a phone call. I sent an email to a person that I'd only been working with a couple of weeks. And I sent this email, and like 10 minutes later, I got a phone call. And we sat on the phone, and I was like, hi, and she said hi, and I said, what's up? And she said, well, you asked me to call, and I said, I didn't ask you to call. She said in your email, you said, please call me, Bill. And I said, no, oh. And I had used it correctly in the first one without a comma, and she had read it as the second one with a comma, and it took us quite a few minutes there to understand what was going on. And then she still couldn't call me Bill, but I tried. So punctuation matters. Don't eat your grandma. Just pay attention to the punctuation. Remember, commas go where commas go. You need them before or after introductory clauses. In the US, we generally use a comma before the and in a list. So apples, comma, oranges, comma, and pears. The UK drops that. That comma after oranges is called the Oxford comma, which I don't fully understand because they don't use it at Oxford. But I would encourage you to use it. Actually improves comprehension. Semicolons we use when we have a complex list, like the bottom one is correct, so you put a semicolon after apples, a semicolon after lemons, to be able to distinguish the citrus fruits in the middle there. We also use semicolons in complex sentences where we have essentially two full sentence structure. You could always put a period where the semicolon is, and it would be grammatically correct. Just one second. It would be grammatically correct there. But the purpose of the semicolon is to bring those two more tightly together. And so the second part should be really closely related to the first part. And this is the one that Mrs. Persons told me never to use. But it turns out it works pretty well in certain circumstances. What was your question?
For the comma, the US and the UK one,
Uh-huh.
like I've noticed more recently, even like some senior people when they'll admit the last comma, and I want to insert it, but I'm like, okay, well maybe this is a new word.
No, put it in.
Okay.
Put it in every time.
The grammar on the internet will collect you, say, without comma would be better sentence, something like that.
Sometimes they do tell you to not put a comma in, but not in that circumstance. They often don't have you put a comma for, like, if you use but at the beginning of a sentence, they'll take the comma out if you put one in. That's because they're just bringing that closer together to the next phrase. The grammar correction in Word is actually pretty good. So maybe I won't have to give this talk anymore if it's all done by that way. Anyway, so the semicolon here is usually fine. Quotation marks, people overuse quotation marks. They tend to, they really should only be used when, in our world, when they're relating to the term to itself. So like we use the term risk to refer to whatever, and we're using quotes there to indicate that the word risk is being talked about as the word itself. We don't or shouldn't use quotations for emphasis. Use bold or italics or some other type font to indicate emphasis. So one of the things that often happens in this talk is that people get angry that I'm trying to make them write simply, and they say, I'm going to lose all my style. And I just make the point that I'll just let you read the quote. Because Zinsser says it as well as anyone here. And with a toupee, there's always a second glance. So anytime you try to add style, you're just going to make it less legible and more difficult to comprehend. So the ways that you can incorporate style effectively, though, are varying the cadence and the rhythm, varying the length of the sentences, using transitions, and sometimes if you have something that you really struggle with, read it out loud, and that often helps a lot. So don't try to be perfect in doing this, because as Schimmel said, everything I said not to do, I do in my first drafts, but first drafts don't matter. No one else sees them. Trying to get a first draft perfect is paralyzing. And a warning, if you think about these principles as you draft, you may never draft anything. And basically, writing well means that you've spent a lot of time from the writing phase to the final product phase, that editing part. And fiddling with it is a good part of it. Like, I have a strategy where I read through a paper just looking for every sentence that begins with it or there and fixing them. I'm not doing anything but fixing those sentences, and I can do it really quickly because I'm just sort of looking through for those words. But I still write them the first time because that's how we talk. So rewriting is really what it's all about. Feel free to slice stuff out as you need to. And I like this last thing. Readers should always feel that you know more about your subject than you've put into writing. In other words, you can't put everything into the paper. And you're only going to write as well as you make yourself write. So tell one story and make it simple and clear and concise and coherent. And then I'll leave you with that little thought there on the bottom and take any questions.